So welcome on. We are passing on to the next organ system of Hoplobatrachus tigrinus, and in this presentation we are going to detail on the nervous system. So the nervous system of frog, it includes central nervous system, peripheral nervous system and sympathetic nervous system. Cranial nervous system comprises brain and spinal cord, while the peripheral nervous system includes all those nerves which arises from brain and the spinal cord. Those nerves which arise from the brain, it is referred as the cranial nerves, and those nerves which arise from the spinal cord, it is known as the spinal nerves. The sympathetic nervous system, it is made of ganglionated sympathetic nerves. So it includes sympathetic nerves and the ganglia associated with the nerves. Here we are going to, in this specific presentation, we will be dealing with the structure of brain in detail. The brain of frog is elongated. You can see over here in this figure, bilaterally symmetrical and white colored structure. It is situated inside the cranial cavity of the skull. So this is the skull, and you can see the space where the brain is placed. It is known as the cranial cavity. So the brain is safely situated in the cranial cavity of the skull, and it is surrounded by a protective layering, which is referred as a meninges. Okay, two layers of meninges are found as a protective covering over the brain of the frog. The innermost layer is known as the pia mater, which is closely applied to the brain, and this pia mater, it is thin, pigmented and vascular connective tissue layer, while outside the pia mater you can see the dura mater, and the dura mater, it is a tough fibrous membrane lining the interior of the cranial cavity. So it is, the dura mater is closely associated with the cranial cavity, the internal lining of the cranial cavity. Fine. Now the pia mater and the dura mater, there is a space between these two layers, and this space is known as the subdural space. Right? This subdural space is filled with a watery fluid, which is referred as a cerebrospinal fluid, which you have already studied in your previous classes, like in class 12, isn't it? The cerebrospinal fluid is the fluid which actually fills up the central canal of the spinal cord as well as the cavities of the brain. The cavities of the brain, it is referred as the ventricles. Okay, so this cerebrospinal fluid, it functions as a shock absorbing fluid. The fluid, it actually protects from the mechanical shock. Okay, now this it is also found, this we can see that it is also found in the ventricles of the brain. Right? Now regarding the structure of the brain, you can see here the this is the anterior part. Okay, so this part, it forms the forebrain. It is otherwise known as the Diencephalon, and this one we can see, this part, it is actually the optic lobes. It is a midbrain, and you have the hindbrain. Okay, we can see it in detail in the previous. So we have the three main parts of the brain: the prosencephalon or the forebrain, the mesencephalon or the midbrain, and rhombencephalon or the hindbrain. Okay, we can see that even though the brain is a very important organ regulating all the activities going on in the body, but a headless frog still has a highly coordinated behavior because of the spinal cord alone. Okay, so the spinal cord has a very important function over there, and these two brings about the coordinated activity. Okay, now you can see here how the brain is placed in the cranial cavity, and how it is giving off the auditory nerve. This is the auditory nerve, isn't it? So the auditory nerve means the nerve which actually arises from the brain, the cranial nerve it is, and it actually innervates the inner ear. Okay, so this is a picture which shows the placement of the brain in the cranial cavity and the giving off of the cranial nerves. Okay, so this is the structure. This is the actual figure. It is almost like 2 centimeters in length from the anterior tip to the posterior tip. This is just 2 centimeters, and it is divided into forebrain, midbrain, as well as the hindbrain. Okay, now we can see what are the structures which actually forms the forebrain. The forebrain is the largest part of the brain, consisting of a pair of anteriorly directed olfactory lobes. Here you can see the structure clearly. So this part here, it is the olfactory lobe. Okay, so a pair of olfactory lobes are seen. Then we can see a pair of cerebral hemispheres and a diencephalon somewhere over here. Okay, so these three parts olfactory lobe, a pair of olfactory lobes, a pair of cerebral hemispheres, and a diencephalon. These three forms together the forebrain, or what is referred as the prosencephalon. The olfactory lobes are anterior, small, spherical structures which are fused together in the median plane. Along the median plane, it is the pair. It is actually fused together, and each lobe it gives off an olfactory nerve and possesses a small cavity. You can see over here anteriorly the olfactory lobe gives off a independently olfactory nerve each. Okay, and inside the olfactory lobe within there's a cavity which is referred as the rhinocele, and this we'll be seeing it in detail when we study the ventricles. Okay, so you have the olfactory lobe and olfactory nerve arising from each of the lobe. Okay, then we have the cerebral hemispheres. The two cerebral hemispheres are long oval structures separated from the olfactory lobe by a slight constriction. It is not so what you call predominantly found. You can see here just a slight constriction. It actually differentiates the olfactory lobe from the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, and these cerebral hemispheres, you can see they are wider posteriorly and narrower in the front, and they are separated from each other by a deep median longitudinal fissure. Okay, so this is the longitudinal cerebral fissure which separates the two hemispheres. And similar to the rhinocele in the olfactory lobe, you can see here another ventricle, the lateral ventricles in each of the lobe. Now posteriorly, you can see the cerebral hemisphere. Posterior to the cerebral hemisphere, you can see the diencephalon. Okay, the diencephalon dorsally it is not so clearly visible because of the overdevelopment of the cerebral hemispheres which hangs over the diencephalon. The diencephalon, it is a very short unpaired structure of the forebrain which is situated behind the cerebral hemisphere, that is a posterior to the cerebral hemispheres, and you can see that the cerebral hemispheres, they are actually a structure which is responsible for the forebrain structure, which is responsible for memory, intelligence, and they regulate voluntary actions, right? While diencephalon is concerned with vision and balance, that is equilibrium. Okay, so these are controlled or coordinated by the diencephalon. Now, when we speak about the internal parts of the forebrain and the cerebral hemispheres and the diencephalon. The cerebral hemispheres, each of the cerebral hemisphere has a large ventricle which is continuous anteriorly with the rhinocele of the olfactory lobe. And these ventricles of the cerebral hemispheres, they are known as lateral ventricles or paracele. Okay. Posteriorly, the lateral ventricles communicate with each other, that is, they actually are in contact with each other and also with the ventricle of the diencephalon. This diencephalon, the ventricle inside the diencephalon is known as diacele or diocele, and the two lateral ventricles and the diocele, they communicate with each other by an opening which is referred as foramen of Monro. These will be looking again in detail when we discuss about the ventricles specifically. Okay, the nerve cell bodies form masses around the lateral ventricles and they lie in layers. Fibers of the olfactory, tactile, and optic impulse reach the cerebral hemispheres, which may act as correlating centers, but the hemispheres are largely olfactory in function. That the cerebral hemispheres they have impulse input from tactile as well as the optic centers. Okay. Then on ventrolateral sides of each of the cerebral hemispheres, there is thick fibrous tract called corpus striatum, which contains a network of white medullated nerve fibers and nerve cells. Corpus striatum, it is actually the thick ventrolateral sides of the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so each of the cerebral hemisphere has a very thick ventral as well as the lateral sides, and that part is known as the corpus striatum. Okay, now the plural it is a corpora striata, singular it is a corpus striata. The corpora striata of the two hemispheres are joined by a transversely running tract of fibers known as anterior commissure. So actually a corpus striatum of one hemisphere communicates with the corpus striatum of the second hemisphere, and it is by way of a transverse tract of fiber which is referred as the anterior commissure. Okay, and above which is another commissure partly representing the hippocampal commissure of the brain of reptiles and mammals, and they have a thick roof called the pallium. So thick roof of the cerebral hemispheres, it is known as a pallium, in which more nerve cells have moved to the periphery. That is, more amount of nerve cells are found towards the periphery of the pallium. Okay, so this is about the cerebral hemispheres. We saw what is where it is located. There are two hemispheres are there, and you can see that the ventrolateral sides are thick, and it is known as a corpus striatum. The two corpora striata are connected by transverse anterior commissure. They are just a tract of nerve fibers. Then the roof of the cerebrum, it is referred as a pallium. Okay, so this is about the cerebral hemispheres. Regarding the diencephalon, the lateral walls of the diencephalon, they are thick, and it is referred as the optic thalamus. Optic thalamus. Okay, so yeah. So its lateral walls are thick, and they are known as optic thalamus, and its floor, it is thick, it is known as the hypothalamus. Its roof is thin and lined with a vascular membrane, it is known as anterior choroid plexus. Okay. Behind it arises a hollow, thin-walled stalk called the pineal stalk, which terminates dorsally at the brow spot. The pineal stalk, which originally was continuous with the brow spot, becomes constricted off from it in early larval stage, and on the ventral side of the diencephalon is the optic chiasma. So on the ventral part of the diencephalon, you can see the optic chiasma, and again you can see that the lateral walls of the diencephalon, it is referred as the optic thalami or optic thalamus. The thick floor is known as the hypothalamus. I hope it is clear. Okay, lateral walls, the two lateral walls are known as optic thalamus, and the floor of the diencephalon, it is referred as a hypothalamus. Okay, hypothalamus, it is almost synonymous with the hypothalamus of the mammals, humans. Okay, the roof, on the other hand, it is referred as the anterior choroid plexus. More than being nervous in nature, they are actually vascular in nature. Okay, it is not a nervous tissue, it is actually the vascular membrane. Then we have the optic chiasma on the ventral side, and on the ventral side itself, it gives off a structure known as infundibulum. The infundibulum ends up in a structure known as hypophysis. Okay, so infundibulum is a median projection posterior to the optic chiasma on the ventral side, and this infundibulum on the distal side, it bears a structure known as hypophysis. It is otherwise referred as a pituitary body. Clear? Now regarding the midbrain, midbrain is well developed, and it is the broadest part. Obviously the longest one was, or largest one was the forebrain. Here it is the broadest part, and it is well developed, consisting of two dorsolateral large rounded optic lobes. So, midbrain is just composed of optic lobes, a pair of large optic lobes. The optic lobes are centers for impulses coming from the eyes, and their cavities are referred as the optic ventricles or the optocele. These optocele communicate with each other as well as with the fourth ventricle behind through a small cavity, a narrow cavity, which is referred as the aqueduct of Sylvius. Below the optic lobes are present two thick longitudinal bands called crura cerebri. So crura cerebri is a pair of longitudinal bands of nerve fibers that run beneath the optic lobes and connects the diencephalon with the medulla oblongata, or we can say that the forebrain with the hindbrain. Okay. Now hindbrain, it consists of the cerebellum and the medulla oblongata, and you can see that the cerebellum is rudimentary, a narrow transverse solid band lying dorsally immediately behind the optic lobes, and its function is to regulate the oculomotor system. Medulla oblongata is concerned with involuntary functions